Hello, my name is John Roscombe. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs, and welcome to this very special discussion today with Dr. Jennifer Marohasy, Senior Fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs, and Dr. Peter Ridd. Jennifer and Peter are coming from Peter's living room in his home in Townsville. Welcome to the more than 400 people who have already joined us around the world and around Australia. We're also going to be joined by Rachel Guy here in our Melbourne studio, and Rachel will be moderating the questions that we'll be taking later on. This discussion will go for about an hour. We're going to be talking about a number of things. We're going to be discussing with Jennifer the new book from the Institute of Public Affairs that Jennifer has edited, Climate Change, the Facts, 2020. I think we've sold now nearly 5,000 copies, and we're into the second print run already, and this builds on the success of previous editions of Climate Change, the Facts. And the book is available from the IPA website, from Australian Scholarly Publishing and all good bookshops. And we're also going to be discussing Reef Heresy, science research and the Great Barrier Reef, that has just been released by Connor Court Press, written by Dr. Peter Ridd. It's going to be a wonderful discussion today, and we'll begin by asking Jennifer and Peter about the last week they've had on the Great Barrier Reef. Welcome, Jennifer. Welcome, Peter. Thank you for being with us. Can you tell us about what you've been doing?
So, John, I've travelled 500 kilometres on a little boat in the last week, visiting 5 different coral reefs, scuba diving them, and beautiful. Each of the reefs was very different. Each of the reefs were beautiful. And I was specifically in search of a type of coral called Porites. I'm not sure if in the studio you have a picture of a Porites coral. It's not this, it doesn't look like the sort of coral that people are used to, or it looks like a large boulder, but it's a very important type of coral. So, Peter, I really did this trip for you because you've been talking about the importance of measuring growth rings, and I've been saying, well, people need to know what a Porites looks like.
Yeah, that's right. They're very important because they have growth rings that's laid down every year, just like a tree ring. And the Australian Institute of Marine Science in 2005 published this paper saying that the growth rate had collapsed quite dramatically between 1990 and 2005 due to climate change. Now, because these Porites are enormous, they record their history over hundreds of years. So we have data from from the year 1600 up to 2005, and they were claiming there was a problem that started in 1990. Now, we said to the Australian Institute of Marine Science, AIMS, that they'd actually made some they'd made some errors with their methodology, and we're sure that they have, and we wanted them to repeat these measurements. In addition to that, they have failed to make any measurements of these growth rates for the last 15 years. So we've got best part of 400 years worth of growth rate up to 2005, but nothing for the last 15 years. And I've been pressing AIMS to do this. And so what Jennifer has been doing is going out there, making sure there's lots of things to measure so we can put pressure on the science institutions to do that. But you're also involved with other stuff, weren't you? You were looking at the reef crest as well.
So we were finding the Porites, and we were measuring the very large ones and documenting exactly where they are. And for example, the last reef we visited, Myrmidon, there was a whole garden, 30, 40, 50 Porites just sitting there ready to be measured, to be cored. Yeah. So I measured the width and the height. It's now for AIMS to go and core them so we can understand the climate history, the growth rates. As well as doing that, we ran transects from the largest Porites following the reef contour and photographing. So there are photographic transects. So people can see, we can document the state of the corals in the vicinity of those varieties.
And Jennifer and Peter, then can I ask you, this is in the context of, we've been reading about UNESCO putting the Great Barrier Reef on the watch and danger list. What does your research indicate about the health of the Great Barrier Reef? Jennifer and then Peter.
So a lot of the UNESCO report is based on the work of Terry Hughes. Now, Terry Hughes, when Peter was at JCU, he was a colleague of Peter's. What Terry's been doing is aerial surveys. He hasn't been scuba diving these reefs. He's been doing aerial surveys of these reefs, focusing just in on the reef crest. Now, the reef crest is the highest part of the reef. It's not representative of the reef more generally. I was comparing, as well as finding the varieties, I was actually showing from the transects and from aerial, we put drones up at the height that Terry Hughes has been surveying to show that from 120 metres up, you can't actually see what's in the reef lagoons. You might be able to see dead reef crests, but there's luxurious corals in the reef lagoons.
So, Peter, why does UNESCO seem to be so willing to accept the very worst case scenario about the Barrier Reef? And as Jennifer said, it looks like there's methodological problems with the evidence they're relying upon.
Well, they've become a political organisation. So, I mean, if you look at so much of the evidence on the reef, in fact, and if you look at it properly, a lot of the stuff that, I mean, some of the stuff the Institute of Marine Science produced has been in error, but others is very good. Their data suggests there's about the same amount of coral now on the reef as when records began in 1985.
Sorry, Peter, can I ask you to, can you just repeat that? Because that is certainly not the narrative we are hearing about. Can you just tell our members about what you just said?
It goes through these big cycles. You know, you lose a lot during cyclones, but it just grows back. And there's the same amount of coral now as in 1985. There's still great coral on all 3,000 of the reefs. Our information indicates that the coral growth rates are about the same or higher than they were 200 to 300 years ago or 100 years ago. So, you know, it's just quite incredible that this almost pristine ecosystem, which is just utterly beautiful, and anybody who goes out will attest to that we've managed to convince the whole world is on its last legs.
And I would argue that if there was some quality of assurance of the small amount of research that they're basing this report on, they would come away with a completely different view. Now, you can go to a reef and you can find stubbly coral, sparse coral. If you go in March when Terry Hughes does his survey, you can find bleached coral on the reef crest, but that is not representative of the ecosystems. There's different habitats within each of those reefs. I was diving the ribbon reefs in January. The crest is completely dead. It's just coral rubble. The coral's growing along the sides, on the ledges. Terry Hughes can't see that from up 120
Jennifer and Peter,
plane.
we've received something like 50 or 60 questions from IPA members in preparation for today. We can't answer them all, but there's a number of themes coming through from the questions, and they're the issues that you have touched upon. Why is there this difference between what you can find and Jennifer, what you've documented in IPA films such as the Beige Reef, the clear evidence and what seems to be part of the popular narrative? How are these two positions reconciled, Jennifer? If they are reconciled.
So with Beige Reef, again, that was a paper where they actually went out and laid these transects. So a transect is a long, you put a measure out and then you record everything along the transect. At Stone Island, they laid the transect along the reef crest because, and Peter can talk about sea level fall, the reef crest has old dead coral, not dead last year, dead for 1,000 or more years. They curtailed the transect. They didn't, if they'd extended the transect at Stone Island just 20 metres, they would have found live coral at the edge where you would expect to find it on a fringing reef. And that edge of live coral extends around Stone Island for about 2 kilometres. That's to the south of Beige Reef. So the transects were laid at in a particular habitat type devoid of coral.
Peter, how has this been allowed to occur? And you've spoken, and we'll talk about Reef Heresy and the integrity of science. How has this been allowed to occur?
Well, it's basically because of the untrustworthiness of the institutions. If you look at a lot of what they say, they are actually strictly correct. So even this IUCN report, what they're saying is that the reef is at a critical risk. And if you actually nail these people down, they'll say, oh, we've never said it's dead. We're just saying it's at risk. I'll give you an example. I've been saying for years that farmers are not killing the reef because supposedly they're being blamed for killing the reef for all the pesticide that gets out on the reef. But actually all the measurements done by other scientists indicate that they're in such low concentrations you can't even measure them. I put the head of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority on the spot at a private meeting. I said, why are you saying that the farmers are killing the reef? And they're saying, oh, we never say that they're killing the reef. We're just saying that there's a risk. And I got back to him and said, well, that's not the message that's getting out to the people. And I'd actually challenged this fellow to a public debate where we could actually, draw this out. And I said to him, you should have come to the debate and the public should have been able to hear you say that, no, farmers are not killing the reef, because that is not the message that you are effectively putting out there.
And talking about misconceptions, we might now move to climate change, the facts. Jennifer, in your chapter, one of your chapters in the book, you talk about how, in fact, average rainfall in southeast Australia is higher than average. You talk about the areas that have been burnt in Australia, which is actually declining. Do you want to talk a little bit about the reception and the reaction to climate change, the facts, and what the general thesis of the book is? Because you've done a wonderful job assembling 20 worldwide experts from 5 different countries on the politics, the science, the economics of climate change. What are you finding in relation to those misconceptions?
So the book's got 3 different sections. The first section we decided this time, with the last book we focused on the Great Barrier Reef. With this book we focus on the polar regions, particularly Antarctica. And the second section's about water vapour as an important greenhouse gas. And then the third section, which includes the chapters that you've been talking about with talking about temperature records, rainfall records, history of bushfires in Australia. We talk about the importance of getting the data correct if we're going to have good public policy. So, for example, with the bushfires at the beginning of this year, and they were devastating bushfires, there was a lot said about how rainfall's declining, and there was a lot said about how temperatures are increasing. What I explain in one of the chapters towards the end of this book is if you go to the Bureau of Meteorology's own data on rainfall, and if you start from the beginning of the record, which is 1900, you will see that there has been no decline in rainfall. But what tends to happen is that they're quite selective with their start date. So instead of starting the record in 1900, and you'll see that there was a Federation drought, which is as dry as anything recently, and then there was droughts in the 1930s, very, very dry. Then it was wet in the 1950s and 60s. What they do is they start the record in 1960. 1956 was a very wet year. If you start then and compare to now, you can get a decline in rainfall, but that's cherry picking a start date. They really need to look at the entire rainfall record in terms of, we've got measurements back to 1900. But in the coral, and this is an opportunity to talk about the importance of coring the parietes, because the early work on the big boulder corals, the parietes corals, that can show you that they had extraordinary droughts right back to the 1600s. That record is when you look at the bands, the growth rings, put it under a fluorescent light, you can see that there's extraordinary variability with respect to droughts and floods across the east coast of Australia.
Yeah, that's true. Because they go back a long time, you can actually see the flood plumes in these little yearly rings. And I think the period from about 1800 to 1850 in North Queensland was unbelievably dry, drier than anything we've seen since. So it's quite a remarkable situation.
Do we know what caused that event?
No, I mean, this is the problem. A lot of this natural variability, we really don't understand what causes it. And this is why we mustn't be too hasty to attribute any fluctuation to anthropogenic causes if you actually don't have any idea of the natural changes. And also, you may not actually have an idea of the genuine extent of those natural changes, especially with rainfall, where we don't have much data going back into the last century.
And Jennifer, just before we move on to Peter's wonderful book, Reef Heresy, the contributors to Climate Change, the Facts 2020 have come from a number of backgrounds and have a number of different perspectives. Is there anything that unites the contributors? What are the common themes that the contributors are raising about temperature, about climate, about change?
I guess the importance of understanding the detail and placing facts in context. And I think that every contributor acknowledges that the climate is changing. It's always changing, but there's nothing unusual about the current rate or magnitude of climate change.
Exactly. Peter, as I said, congratulations on Reef Heresy. It has an introduction by Jennifer, and the IPA's Morgan Begg has written a section on the legal case. Before I ask you about the High Court and progress with your case, what do you want people to take out of reading Reef Heresy? What are the messages you want people to understand and come to?
Well, essentially all the major threats, with one exception, are just massively exaggerated. The exception is I still am a little bit concerned about the ocean pH, the sort of like the acidity of it, but all the other threats, the increasing temperature, effective farming, just don't worry about them.
Just on that acidification, if they cored the old parietes, because in the technical literature in the early 1980s, they were saying, well, increased temperature, increased growth rate, but that's going to be offset by ocean acidification. All they have to do is go to Myrmidon Reef. I was there not very many days ago. The parietes are sitting there. They can court, they can test the hypothesis.
Exactly, that's right. And if the calcification or the growth rate has collapsed in the last 15 years, then I'll be the first to say, well, we really have a problem with the reef. By the way, I don't think it will, because I know that their previous work, they actually made some errors on that. But going back to the book, so the real theme then comes to how do you get to the state where so much of the reef research is just in error? And we just have a fundamental quality assurance problem in our, especially environmental science institutions. They've been taken over by ideology, and when you don't have the quality assurance systems, well, this is what we end up with. And so there's sections there on how we might improve, bring the quality assurance in.
And how do we do that?
Well, I've been pushing, and there's a problem with this because when science is used in industry, industry will check it. And if it's wrong, well, it'll be wrong, and they just won't worry about it. But the problem is when science is used by governments. Governments don't actually check the science upon which they base public policies. It's unbelievable, but they don't. And so I've been asking
well,
for... Well,
they don't if it agrees.
No, well, that's right. Yes, that's true. If it's against the ideology...
They ignore it.
That's right. But so we need the quality assurance system, like an Auditor General's department in science. We've got to make sure that it's not taken over by the bad guys. I've got some details of how that might be set up, a bit like red teams that are used in the military to challenge, generals and admirals. We need something like that to be set up very formally. But if there's a government organisation that is properly tasked with it, then they couldn't ignore it. Of course, the problem is, would that government organisation also be taken over by the bad guys? And I talk about how we might avoid that.
And that's one of the questions. You use the term Heretic Peter. So the heretic inside Peter reads Fight for Freedom of Speech on Climate Change is, of course, the title of the IPA's podcast that's been very successful, narrated by Gideon Rosner. You use the term Reef Heresy. Do you feel like a heretic, Peter? That's one of the questions that I've been asked.
Well, I'm not strictly, because a heretic is actually telling something that is not true, you know, in the sort of the religious sense. I'm actually saying it is true, and that's why the book has a question mark. Am I a heretic or otherwise? And I don't think I am. But of course, on the other side, they do regard a lot of what I'm saying as heresy. They really do. I mean, we had an incident just yesterday down at the Australian Institute of Marine Science, and the hatred for putting the point of view that maybe that the reef is not as badly damaged as...
We should put this in context. We've been filming the reef, under the water, above, travelling to the inner, midshore, outer the last week, specifically in search of these parietes, because they're the ones that AIMS needs to core. We hoped that they would meet with us at AIMS so that I could show them the pictures.
How did that go?
Of all the, what they refused. They won't meet with us. So Peter said, well, let's at least just go out there and get a picture of, you know, the front gate at AIMS. And people just don't know how big AIMS is. It's a huge complex. I got it all on my drone. I put my drone up yesterday afternoon so people could see. It's going to be in this documentary how big and how beautiful this complex is.
And just before...
It wasn't funny, really.
We come to asking Peter about the case. Can I ask both of you, because again, this is a question that's come up a lot. Peter, you worked at JCU for decades. Jennifer, you've been working and involved with universities for decades. Has something happened in the last few years to exacerbate this tendency to crush dissent? There's a feeling from IPA members that something in the last few years has dramatically changed. So we now don't have debates, we have abuse. They don't, Peter, investigate your research. JCU sacks you. Do you sense that, or has this been a long time coming and we've simply seen now a culmination of trends over many years? Peter and then Jennifer.
I think something did change quite dramatically about 10 years ago, that we were drifting in that direction, and you could see that for decades, but it suddenly, we literally had a tipping point. My previous Vice-Chancellor used to get complaints about Bob Carter, the great Bob Carter, climate skeptic, and he would go into bat for Bob Carter and say to these complainants, look, he's a professor of geology here, if you've got a problem with him, you argue with him, but I'm not going to get involved in this. Whereas the present Vice-Chancellors and most Vice-Chancellors at most universities nowadays would be worried about the corporate image of the university. We don't want to be involved with deniers. We've got to be supposedly respectful. And it just suddenly changed, I think probably 10 years ago.
Jennifer?
I think there's a lot less confidence on the other side. I think that Peter and I, for example, we're always asking the question, you know, have we got something wrong? Let's go back to the scientific method. Before I went on the trip, I was emailing Peter and 3 other scientists the hypotheses that I was going to ask, and I wanted to make sure I got it so correct. Whereas I think the other side realizes that that they are vulnerable, that it hasn't, and I think at a particular level, they really think that in the end, the means justifies the ends. Yep. So let's not get too caught up in the methodology. Let's just protect and save the environment, virtual signal, and everybody on our team will cheer. And anyway, there's going to be no quality assurance because we control, and what we don't like, we don't let into the journals. And they have got rid of a lot of people from universities before Peter. Peter's not the first person. They have been, they've been ridding people, but the difference between Peter and everybody else is that Peter has been prepared to stay and fight, and he's had the backing of the IPA, and he's had the backing of Cheryl, his wife, because so often, and his children, because so often I think people just say, look, it's not worth it. You know, you're going to lose all your friends. You know, you've got no career. And I think that it hasn't actually been, even though you've had so much support, Peter, it hasn't been easy all along, has it?
No, not that easy. That's right.
And just before we go to Rachel's question, I'll point out, Jennifer and Peter, that of course there's 3,500 Australians at least who've supported Peter and his case, and will come through Peter's GoFundMe program. So we'll come back to the case in a moment, but we'll welcome Rachel Guy here in Melbourne studio. And Rachel, you've got a question for us.
Yes, John. Hello to all of our members. Great to see you, and great to see you, Jennifer and Peter. Now, we do have a question in from Malcolm in Misterton in Queensland. Malcolm, are you there? Would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Hi, folks. Lovely to see you. Even though we are just around the corner, I haven't actually met you, Peter. But one day we'll have a beer together. My question is, I've got friends from a long time ago, since the 70s. We've been great friends for many years, but two of them in particular support Extinction Rebellion. And we've had kind of debates over email to discuss this. And I've got to the point now where I either back off or risk losing the friendship. I wonder if you come across this kind of situation and how you deal with it.
I've definitely come across that, and you probably should just back off. We'll either become extinct or we won't, you know. Some people you just can't argue with. If you can argue with them, I think you should, and you actually have a duty to do that. One of the problems is that our side of the debate often will back away because you don't want to ruffle feathers, you don't want to be cancelled, and that is a problem. But with some people, it's just not possible, and you're better off just avoiding it.
Jennifer?
I actually think that there is one place where you can start, and that is you can say, well, let's agree that the climate's changing. And I think if you start there with the acknowledgement, you say, I agree that the climate's changing. That's a really great, and it's quite disarming of the other side when you say, look, I don't deny that the climate's changing, but maybe you don't want to jump straight into rates and magnitude. Maybe you want to open it up by saying what most concerns you. And I was actually talking to somebody who was a member of Extinction Rebellion, who's a scuba diver. This was November last year. And she said, well, it's cyclones that they're just, you know, they're destroying the reef. There's more of them. They're increasing in intensity. And I said, well, let's have a look at the data. And I knew where to go. And I guess it's important that people read these books so they know where to go in terms of the detail. So I showed her the Bureau of Meteorology data in terms of number and frequency of cyclones. And she then changed to another issue, and I went with her. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, no, and I think it is important to go into the detail. When I get somebody like that, and I think I can, you know, there's some chance there, I will always start by talking about the Holocene climatic optimum, you know, just a few thousand years ago when it was a couple of degrees hotter. I talk about the water vapor and how we don't understand the water vapor cycle. So the models are really not fit for purpose for prediction. And ultimately our side, if we are going to debate these things, we do need to get our head around some of those details. But I still reckon there's some people that it's just not worthwhile trying. And if they're in this Extinction Rebellion, they're probably in that category. Most people are in nowhere near that extreme though. And
Jennifer, to follow on from Malcolm's question, what strikes me about both Climate Change, the Facts, 2020, and Reef Heresy is that you emphasise the lack of certainty about so much of the data. Jennifer, you keep on talking about we have to ask the questions. Is part of what we're seeing now this desire for an unnatural certitude about the science when there is still a lot of things we don't know about how the world works and how its environment works?
Can I
Peter,
I'd just like to answer that. Sorry. In the case of climate change, I think that's true. In the case of the reef, we now have more than enough data on most of the threats to be able to say they just are a non-issue.
But Peter, wouldn't it be better if we actually said, and we asked the question, and this is why I went in search of parietes, and I've got all these pictures of parietes at all these different reefs. I think that we need to say to AIMS, let's ask the question, are coral calcification rates increasing or decreasing? You used to core these corals to find out. Now, before I got on the boat, so many people said to me, Jen, they're not coring the parietes anymore because they're all dead. Now, you said to me, you're not going to find the parietes they used to core. I said, let me go out and see if I can find some really old corals, some really old parietes. Now, I found them 3 meters by 3 meters. So now let's say what we've done is we know there's parietes out there. We know they're large. We know they're healthy. We know that they're at all the reefs. Can we ask the question, how are they being affected by climate change? So, you can say, you don't even have to have a position. You can say, as a skeptic, as an IPA member, I've seen these pictures of parietes. I understand that they hold a climate history. I understand that AIMS hasn't cored them for 15 years. Wouldn't it be great if we could get some coring done so we could answer the questions about growth rates? And we might even say, if Jennifer's really concerned, because I am, that if they're being affected by global warming, we need to know that. So we need to answer that question. We need AIMS to go and core the parietes.
Jennifer, I think you've just given us the text to a letter that all IPA members are going to send to their local Member of Parliament. So,
thank you.
Rachel, we have another question.
Yes, John, we have another question here from John in Manly Vale in New South Wales. John, now are you just able to take yourself off mute there?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Look, thanks for your mention of the research, Jennifer. I heard Joe Baker speak many years ago about the drought record that was far in excess of the variance to anything we've seen in recorded history. My question is concerning adaptability of corals and how much we know about that, because I've been diving the coral triangle, mostly PNG and Solomons, and lately Indonesia, since 2012. The only coral I've seen bleached was in a tiny bit in Bougainville, and then Bougainville in New Britain, and then the worst I've ever seen is actually in coral of the Pocillopora species, and that was at Coffs Harbour, where we're seeing lots of tropical species coming south, and this particular species is being obviously bleached. So do we know much about why are there so many, temperatures warming so much, why isn't there more bleached coral up in the tropics proper?
Peter, for those of us who aren't scuba divers, I'm going to ask you to talk to us in layperson's terms about that, and I'll ask Jennifer too.
Well, the reason there's not much bleaching, even though temperatures have got a bit hotter in the last 40 years, is because corals, there's massive swings in temperature between day and night, summer and winter, but also corals, more than almost any other species, have the ability to adapt to changing temperature, because they have inside the little polyp, they have this little this algae growing inside them, which gives them energy from the sun, and that's what they expel when they bleach, sometimes when it gets hot. The thing is, there's many species of these what we call zooxanthellae, and depending on which type the coral decides to take in, the same species of coral can deal with very hot water or very cold water. And when they bleach, they'll often chuck out this algae and bring in a better type that is more suited to the temperature they're in. So corals, far more than almost any other species, can deal with climate change, whether it's anthropogenic or whether it's naturally caused.
Jennifer?
There has been bleaching. There was bleaching at the Ribbons in
So Jennifer, do you just want to unpack a little bit, because we hear a lot about this term bleaching. Do you just want to unpack what is bleaching and why is it a bad thing or a good thing?
So bleaching occurs when the water warms up, the corals are a little bit uncomfortable and they expel the zooxanthellae. So a coral colony, usually when you see a pretty staghorn coral, that's actually made up of lots of tiny polyps within a corallite structure. Within the polyp are zooxanthellae. And so all corals have polyps and tentacles. Some corals, most hard corals, have zooxanthellae. So they've actually got more than one way of feeding themselves. They'll use the tentacles to grab passing prey, and they use the zooxanthellae to capture the sun's energy. So corals are amazingly resilient at one level because they've got these zooxanthellae that they take in, and they use the zooxanthellae to generate energy to create the calcium structure that they use to grow bigger and bigger. Now, when the water temperatures get a bit hot, they will expel the zooxanthellae, but that doesn't mean that they're dead. You can have a coral that's and when they get rid of that zooxanthellae, they can go a very stark white color. But the tentacles can still be swaying, and they can still actually be ingesting food. And at the ribbons, when they bleached in 2016-17, there were corals that bleached in March. So they may have been a nice pink color before. They expelled the zooxanthellae because they were uncomfortable with the water temperature. They had no zooxanthellae for 5-6 months. Some of those corals even spawned, even though they were bleached. And then they took back a more warm adapted zooxanthellae that they felt more comfortable with. So this idea that a bleached coral is a dead coral is just not true. But I guess thank you for indulging me, giving me the time to explain all of that. There are corals that expel the zooxanthellae and then just die, but they're a small percentage of the corals that bleach.
So what you're talking about is the potential for growth and change in the Great Barrier Reef, because certainly the image, for example, presented to my children in their classroom is that once a coral is bleached, it is dead, and that is it for the Great Barrier Reef, which is why we must put it on the endangered list.
Yep, I mean, most of the coral does not bleach, and most of the bleached coral does not die. So if you look at the, a couple of the big events, 2016, there were various claims up to 93% of the coral bleached. I estimate, if you look at all the data, you don't just look at the shallow coral, you also look at the deeper coral.
So say the reef crest.
Yeah.
Terry Hughes talks about the reef crest, which is the shallow.
That's right. Maybe 8% died on one of in those big events. Now that sounds like a lot of coral, but you've got to remember that, say, between 2011 and 2016, there was a 250% increase in the amount of coral after this big cyclonic event wiped it out. So an 8% loss, well, it can make that up in a year or two. And if you actually look at the amount of coral there is today, relative to what it was just before the big bleaching event, it's about the same now. It's barely changed in the last few years, despite we're told we've had 3 massive bleaching events in 5 years. Rachel, you've got a question.
Yes, John. So we've been talking to a few of our members on the chat here in Zoom. And from what you've been talking about, a lot of people have been asking, how much is it to core parietes? And is that something that we can do ourselves?
Can it be a research program of the IPA?
Yeah.
Well, this matter came up at the Senate inquiry because I was saying...
Oh, Peter, do you want to go back to it? I just want to unpack what the Senate inquiry is about and what your role is in that, because I think many people will be very interested.
Well, we got a Senate inquiry into, it was mostly on the effect of agriculture on the reef, but of course all these other things come into it. And the senators asked all these questions about, well, why haven't we been coring the reef for the last 15 years? Because this is fabulous data which we should have, and we don't have the data. And we managed to pin the director of AIMS down. He sort of said, yeah, we could do it. I've estimated it's a few $1 million, which is a lot of money, but considering that we're spending $500 million in the next few years, and that's just the beginning, looking at the reef, a few $1 million to do a bit of quality assurance and also do this coring is not very much. And frankly, if AIMS continue to refuse to do this work, we will have to try to raise money from the government or some other way to do it ourselves. We've got to get this data.
Are we going back to Myrmidon to core?
Jen wants to go back to Myrmidon. She thinks she's a mermaid, you see. But yes, we do need to go back to to these, and this work has to be done.
I would like to be a mermaid.
Yes, she does.
Before we go on to some other questions, I have mentioned and referred to the High Court case. Many questions about it, Peter. How is it going? How are you feeling? And when might we have a result?
Well, we've got a hearing, almost certainly in February, to decide whether we will have a hearing. I think we've got a good chance of, having the hearing later in the year. What the probability of that is, well, it's anybody's guess. I mean, if you go on the data so far, we've had 4 judges, 2 have been against us, 2 have been more or less for us, so 50-50 chance. But we've just got to allow the legal wheels to churn, and we'll see what will happen. But it'll be interesting to see.
One of the questions that we received earlier, and it's a theme of questions, is something that both of you have been talking about, which is the division between publicly funded science out of Canberra and then local industries. And what struck me, Peter, is how much support you have from Queensland MPs, from Townsville representatives, from local industries, from farming, from fishing, from tourism. Is that an overlay to some of this debate about the Great Barrier Reef, what we might like in Sydney or Melbourne or Canberra versus people who actually live on the reef? Both of you are Queenslanders, and Jennifer, you're in Noosa, you're passionate about the ocean, about nature. Is that an overlay to some of this debate? Are we seeing some of this inner city elites versus the rest of mainstream Australia at play in this debate?
Without any shadow of a doubt, and I actually devote a little bit of time to that exact issue. Frankly, we're a little bit resentful. A lot of us up here are a little bit resentful for the people in the cities telling us about things about which they know nothing. And it's a big issue. I actually dedicate this book to farmers because they are massively affected by this economically, but it's even worse than that. And they'll come home, just like you mentioned, your kids have told you, John, that the reef is dying. Well, these farmers come home and their children tell them that the farmers, are killing the reef. Now, you can imagine how that feels if you're a farmer. So there's definitely a groundswell of opposition about the reef science. And I'm quite sure that this Office of Science Quality Assurance, which we want to check reef science and then ultimately other science, it's going to happen because there's a lot of politicians up this way who are fairly committed to that over the next few years.
Jennifer, what do you think so much of this debate is about? Is it city versus country?
I think it's got layers and levels. I want, yes, as you said, I want to connect people to nature. I want us to do it by asking questions, good questions. For example, there are parietes just at High Island that I filmed and measured. That's just at the mouth of one of the biggest, a very large Russell Mulgrave river system. If agriculture was having an impact, because that's what 5 k's out, less than that, we could test whether agriculture was having an impact on the corals at that reef just by coring those parietes, because it would be affecting their growth rates. So, I mean, you can be tribal or not. I guess I really like to break through to all sorts of people who care about nature, farmers, but also fishers, divers. I mean, I think people want to know what the truth is. A lot of people are frightened to ask the hard questions, and they're frightened to ask questions they don't know the answer to. And I think somehow or another we need to take that fear away by just telling people that it's okay to ask questions, go outside, walk along the shoreline, think about why there's 2 tides every day. There's a lunar and a solar influence on tides, on corals.
Can I just add to that, John, that the big difference between the city and the country people is the fact that we've got skin in the game, all right? So it's our industries which are being effective, it's not yours, all right? So what then happens is when a farmer is told, well, you're killing the reef, or he'll think, well, is that really true? And so he will delve into it, he'll look at the data and say, well, it doesn't make sense. I go out to the reef, I don't see this. I'm looking at the data on pesticides, well, where's the high concentrations? Whereas a person in the city, there's no skin in the game. It doesn't matter if it's wrong. We can virtue signal that we're going to save the reef. And because that you don't have any skin in the game, you don't delve into it, you just accept the scientific institutions rather than question them.
But people don't like their kids being fearful about the environment. I mean, every person who has a child who's frightened that the Great Barrier Reef is now dead, I mean, they have an interest in knowing the truth and closing down farming if it really is killing the Great Barrier Reef. I mean, I think most Australians really want to know what the state of the Great Barrier Reef is.
But because it doesn't affect them absolutely directly, I think there's less motivation to actually really go into the science.
And when President Obama tells us the reef is under threat, then we're inclined to listen. Rachel, you have a question.
Come and visit.
Yes.
Rachel. Oh, I think we...
Hey, John. It's Stephanie here. Hi, everyone. Rachel's just having a bit of technical issues.
Welcome. For everyone, I'll just introduce Stephanie. Stephanie Campbell.
James, he will be with us shortly. James, are you there?
Can hear you, James. Hello.
Yep.
Hi, James.
Can you just unmute yourself there?
Are we having any luck?
We're having a bit of technical issues. So I've got James's question here. He said, SBS screened the Earth from space and majored on the bleaching of the barrier reef during the last 3 years. How can we answer these claims that satellite pictures are proving that the reef is dying?
We just did it last week. We went out and we showed that what you can see, even at 150 meters, you're only seeing the reef crest. Yeah. You actually need to ground truth, and not just with respect to the reef crest. You need to understand that a lot of the corals, for example, right along the ribbons, they're growing vertically on the ledges. You can't see them from satellites. No, that's right. The corals in the lagoon at Myrmidon, that's where Myrmidon Reef, where the big parietes are, they're down 12, 15, 17 meters. You can't see them from space.
But you see, the Australian Institute of Marine Science, who I'm often very critical of, they've actually been running an excellent program every year for 40 years, measuring about 100 reefs a year where they scuba dive at 10 meters depth around the circumference of 100 reefs a year. And they've been plotting the coral cover, and it's about the same now as it was in the 1980s, despite all the climate change and all the supposedly pollution from the farms. So there is no change. Effectively in the coral grade.
10 meters is not the crest.
No, that's right. It's below.
The crest you see from the satellite.
That's right. But the coral goes down a lot further than that. I mean, it goes down to 40 to 50 meters, but at least it's better data than the crest.
In the last 5 or 6 minutes that we have, can I ask both of you about the future? And again, this is a theme of many of the questions that came through from IPA members. What can we do to reignite the debate about the science and about data and about evidence? Because as I hear both of you today, and as I read the Reef Heresy and Climate Change, the facts, I see the data, I see the evidence, but I also see that people are not necessarily listening because it's just too challenging. How do we shift the paradigm, Peter?
We've got to concentrate a little bit less on the detail of the science and more on the quality assurance processes. We've got ourselves into this mess because the processes are broken in the science institutions. That is what we've got to concentrate. We know we obviously can't afford to ignore the detail. The detail is really important, but we tend to get focused on the detail of the science and not on the actual quality assurance processes. And that's what we've got to go for. And that's what I'm pushing with the various politicians up in North Queensland, with the agricultural groups as well.
Jennifer?
I think that people need to be prepared to ask questions. They need to get a little bit into the detail, buy and read both these books. And yeah, I actually think that it is important that people keep asking questions, that they are informed. So people need to stay members of the IPA. They need to keep supporting the IPA so that we can support Peter. Because if Peter wins, he's got this discussion right the way to the High Court. If Peter wins in the High Court, we all win, and science especially wins. So people need to really, we've got a bit of momentum. We're behind Peter. The IPA is behind Peter. Join more people up. Get them reading these books. Get them to find out why Peter is going to the High Court. What's going to be discussed. It's not only an issue of freedom of speech, it's an issue of science. And as I said, if Peter wins, we all win, and especially science wins.
Peter, what's at stake in your case in February?
Well, it really is whether or not the university system is, whether we have to just write it off entirely. Because if academics can't say some even slightly controversial things, because my interpretation of the present appeal decision, which went against us, is that, if you've got to respect and all this type of stuff other people all the time, and respect is a very nebulous word, then nobody can ever say anything. And it's really the end of anything controversial at universities. It would be a disaster, actually.
Peter, and just asking for quality assurance.
Peter, I'm going to ask you then to go a little bit further, and I'll ask Jennifer this too. Again, a theme not just from questions we've received over the last few days, but about the IPA's work in general.
Yeah.
Are Australia's universities salvageable?
I think they probably are.
How would you do it?
But it's going to be hard. I mean, us winning in the court, if presumably we do win, that's a necessary but not sufficient condition. There needs to be a cultural change in the way the universities have become. They've become very corporatist. They're not education institutions. They've been run essentially by the upper echelon rather than by the academics. So rather than being a loose tribe of academics all arguing and doing their thing, they've become like a company worried about its reputation. That needs to be changed as well. So yes, they probably are salvageable, but maybe they're not as well.
Jennifer, you know universities very well.
I think that there's a lot of good people out there that are curious, and I think that we need to explain what the scientific method is, and maybe we can get there by asking for some quality assurance. And yeah, just I think there's some good people in the universities, but there's a whole top layer that needs to just be sacked. I mean, this government could sack them all, couldn't they? They could be done with some of the top echelon, and then you would get people coming forward who did care, who were curious.
That's right. I mean, on the freedom of speech thing, if there was a $10 million fine for every university that broke the freedom of speech, academic freedom of speech, then you'd suddenly find a behavioural change. But it means it needs a conservative government, a genuinely conservative government. Well, actually, even the left wing is now getting very worried about it, but it needs a government to take this really seriously. And they should realise that the left wing's on our side, the right wing's on our side, the centre's on our side, the union's on our side on this. There are no political risks to academic freedom of speech in universities.
And just before we move to off universities and finish our conversation, Peter, have you been struck by the massive support you've had from academics, but also the fact that so many of them have felt they've had to say it privately to you?
Yes, that's right. I mean, a lot of academics will have contributed to my GoFundMe. A lot of farmers have. Of course, the IPA, it's been absolutely wonderful. I think it's something like 5,000 donations, $1.4 million altogether of donations in addition to the 300,000 that we've paid. So this is an example of where you can really see that people are worried. And it's not just people on the right, it is people on the left as well who are really worried about this issue. So you should take heart out of that, in fact.
As we bring this conversation to a close, I asked you, Peter, about the Reef Heresy and what you want people to finish as they read the book. Why did you write it? Why is it so important?
Well, look, I come from an agricultural. I'm a POM originally, but I come from Innisfail. It's a sugar growing area, and I could see what's happening to the agricultural industries, how all this legislation was coming in, how it was hurting the farmers personally in the heart, that they were supposedly killing the reef. And I just thought, we've just got to get the truth. I mean, I'm just interested in getting the truth out. Now, I may have some of the stuff that I've got may be wrong. I've made lots of mistakes in my life, so I dare say there'll be more in here. But it's by, helping with this, at least I've written it down, and hopefully we will get to the truth on the reef, and we will be able to get proper policy settings for the farmers and for everybody else.
Jennifer, what are your final conclusions about Climate Change, the Facts 2020? What did you learn as you put the book together and brought together some wonderful contributors from around the world?
I think that we've learnt a lot about how unreliable the historical temperature data is, and that, don't take the homogenised data, look carefully at it. We've almost sort of nailed that, and now we can sort of move on and say, okay, well, if temperatures don't exactly move like that, but we have these cycles, and if water vapour is a greenhouse gas, what would a new theory of climate look like? And there's been a lot written by philosophers of science, and the history of science would tell us that often, you can have your rebuttal, but you really need to just move things forward by coming up with a new theory of climate change. And I think we begin that in this book, in section 2 of this book. So I think the IPA and the contributors to this book are moving us forward beyond rebuttal, but actually moving us forward in terms of a new theory of climate. And I sort of see that by us insisting on the coring of the parietes, because again, we're just saying, okay, let's just see what, using this method, acknowledging that the climate changes, let's see what the corals tell us. And you talk about this, page 7 of that book. In this book, we say, okay, let's acknowledge that the climate changes. Let's acknowledge that there's more than carbon dioxide that's a greenhouse gas. There's also water vapor. If we focus in on water vapor and clouds, what's driving climate change? Peter's got a great chapter in here, chapter 12. I don't know if we've got time to talk about it.
We don't, because I'm going to have to, unfortunately, conclude this discussion, but I am going to conclude, Jennifer and Peter. Jennifer, by quoting from your introduction, which is a lovely capturing of, I think, what we've been talking about for the last hour, which is, and you say this in your introduction, we've touched on it today. Remember, it is much better to have questions that cannot be answered than living and doing science according to answers that cannot be questioned. Can I thank you, Jennifer? Can I thank you, Peter? Not just for a great discussion today, and not just for 2 wonderful books, but also for all that you have done over many, many years. Jennifer, your leadership at the IPA has been wonderful. Peter, you are a beacon of hope and truth for so many Australians. Can I wish both of you a Merry Christmas? Can I thank the more than 500 IPA members who have tuned in over the course of this conversation? It's only with your support that we can do the work that we do. Every IPA member has been sent the 2020 IPA annual report. You'll read about our wonderful success, our growth, our increase in membership, and you'll also read the stories of Peter Ridd and Jennifer Marohasy. Thank you for your support. This brings this discussion to an end.